All right, so this video talks a lot about step three and determining the transaction price. The biggest issue that can arise here is variable consideration. And this is when there's some aspect of the contract that will provide a distribution of outcomes to what we might receive as a result of the transaction. So we might, for example, get incentive payments for finishing up early, right? In a construction project, there can be some bonus for early completion of the project, and the likelihood that we're going to finish and meet that deadline for early finishing and receive the extra bonus is a variable consideration. In healthcare, this happens a lot with providers who are seeking and sending documentation to insurance companies so that the insurance company will kick in and pay as an amount of the bill for the customer, right? That is going to be also not 100%, but based on the provider's historical patterns with getting reimbursements for different services that they're providing to their patients. For manufacturing, product returns and volume discounts. Remember from your days of maybe accounts receivable and cash versus trade discounts, volume discounts tend to be a trade discount where we just, if a certain amount is ordered, then we take a certain percent off of the list price. There can also be cash discounts, right, for prompt payment, but that also is dealt with in our receivable accounting through sales discounts, gross method versus net method. Product returns are also dealt with in a sales returns transaction. These three are not performance obligations. If there's a volume discount, well, the customer either orders that volume or they don't, right? That in terms of that volume discount, right? Um, with sales returns, it's just a window on the product, and we want to assess that and then create an account sales returns that will reduce the revenue appropriately as estimating those future returns that could be made on the product. And the cash discount is either recorded through a gross or net method and then dealt with in that way. So these are not performance obligations. But when there is some bonus for meeting standards or thresholds, or other types of variable consideration, this definitely is something that can influence our recording of the revenue we want to recognize. In terms of a real world note, notice that this is something that SEC comment letters have focused on a lot. There can be aggressive estimation here that companies are overly optimistic about their ability to meet these variable considerations and enhance their revenue. So be very careful when working with this in practice and be very skeptical when companies are recording revenue under variable consideration routes. There's two methods that are allowed under practice. There's the expected outcome and the most likely amount. Expected outcomes are make more sense intuitively to use when there are multiple outcomes, right? So, for example, here, if we have a 40% likelihood we could get, or 20% we could get 1,000, 40% we'll get 1,500, 30% we'll get 2,000, 10% we'll get 3,000. That's a lot of different outcomes: 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000. And because each one has its own probability associated with it, the best way to do it is just a simple expected value where we multiply each of the bonuses by their likelihood, their projected probabilistic likelihood, and then sum them together, right? So given this distribution of outcomes, the expected value is that we'll end up at 1,700. So when there's a wide array of outcomes, the expected outcome is where we want to go. With the most likely amount, this tends to be a better option when there are very few, or two or three maybe, um, potential outcomes. And one of them just is kind of maybe rocking the boat, right? But if we were to apply this in a array of outcomes, as we did up here, 20, 40, 30, 10, well, 40% is the most likely. So we would just roll with the expectation that we're going to get 1500 rather than the expectation of evaluating all of the outcomes was 1700. So again, let's return to the same industry. We're going to dislodge ourselves from interfacing with the customers. And now Myrmidon is contracting with another gaming company, KP Sports. So KP Sports is contracting with our company Myrmidon, and KP is willing to pay Myrmidon 400,000 as an upfront cost just to access that multi-user platform that Myrmidon has, right? That's the one that Myrmidon was selling to its customers. Well, here's another gaming company that wants its users to be able to use this platform, to PR itself, to get some more splash and some more users associated with its games. So it's going to pay 400,000 for a year of access, but um, it will pay an additional 120,000 if users log more than 15,000 hours on the platform playing its games. So if basically what KP is paying for here, or the additional amount is, well, if this is wildly successful, right? If our users actually really like what you're providing, that we got them access to for paying you $400,000, then we'll pay you extra because it was so wildly successful. So if they do log more than 15,000, then Myrmidon gets an extra 120. So the probability distribution is that it's 75% likely that users would log more than 15,000 hours. So 75% likely we're going to get Myrmidon will receive this $120,000 and accrue that bonus receivable. We'll be able to recognize that probability as revenue. So there are only two options. It would make more sense in this case, in my opinion, to use the most likely amount, but just to explore how expected outcome versus most likely can influence this, let's just look at what it would be under either one. So the $400,000 is really set. This is something we don't have to manipulate. That is just for access. Really, what's at stake here is this 120. And if we're using the expected likelihood, it's 75% that we will log the sufficient hours for that bonus to trigger, and Myrmidon will get its variable consideration for that. Now it's 25% likely that they don't, because it's either they pass the 15 or they don't, and that's $0, right? So that's going to come in as a big fat goose egg. And then we have 75% of 120,000, which is three quarters, which is 90,000. So using the expected outcome approach, we have a $90,000 likelihood, or a price, right? That's what we expect to get from this, given that it's 75% likely we're going to meet this threshold. So with this particular example, if we have $400,000 for a year, it's an upfront fee of $4,000. We have to provide this over time. The $400,000 isn't a point of sale revenue, largely because, and this is something we're going to talk about in a bit, but basically, well, it's a subscription, and it's really a subscription to intellectual property of Myrmidon, right? The intellectual property is this multi-user platform. If Myrmidon were to go down, if they were to stop, like shut down, the power goes out, whatever happens, right? They run out of business. That multi-user platform is unlikely to continue to exist. And so that's what we have symbolic IP, not functional IP. It's not a perpetual license. It's a functional I'm sorry, it's symbolic that requires continuing existence and support from Myrmidon. And so that PO is still deferred revenue for Myrmidon. And again, we'll just assume cash unless otherwise said. So this is for that upfront cost of $400,000 for a year. So it's really subscription. So this is the subscription to multi-user platform. And remember, we're from the vantage point of Myrmidon still. We're just not interacting with customers. We're interacting with a separate software system and a separate gaming industry competitor or um, other company. So for the variable consideration, though, we're not receiving cash up front for variable consideration, right? So that's something that's a little different. Here, for the variable consideration amount of 90,000, we record this as a bonus receivable. So it is an asset, but it's not cash and it's not an account receivable. Right? This is a little more dubious, a little less certain than an account receivable. And again, this would be considered deferred revenue. Until we meet the requirements to obtain this bonus, which is to say we passed 15,000 users, it should remain as deferred revenue. And so, of course, that's that bonus receivable, receivable being the operative word, triggers an asset classification. It's an expected future economic benefit. My deferred revenue is a liability, and we can record those as such. Now, that's how we would record the initiation of this, and we would see how that progresses over time. If we're doing the most likely amount, right, well, then 75% it is greater than 25%. So that is the amount that we would want to record the contract as and under these conditions. And we would still record the upfront cost the same as before, cash and deferred revenue for 400,000. That's just that access. And we could recognize the deferred revenue over the course of a year, right? Because they have a year's access based on this $400,000. That's what's set up here. And we would recognize it over the year, just like we would in the other one. I just wanted to call attention to that again. Recognize subscription revenue as time passes. And then for the most likely amount, well, because the 120 is the more likely, right? All we do is look at these percents. Okay, this is the biggest one. We're going to take that amount, ignore the expectations of anything else happening. That means that the bonus receivable and the deferred revenue that corresponds to that bonus would be valued at 120,000. Now, that's the variable consideration under the most likely amount. Now, we're going to start talking in class and working through some problems where, we see how this falls out. For example, in this problem, there wasn't there wasn't any sort of like, oh, this has to happen within a certain amount of months, right? Maybe it was going to be um, that we have 6 months to log 15,000 hours on the platform, or maybe it was the full year. Who knows, right? If that's the case, then we would want to record that bonus receivable um, at the outset if we had some expectation, right, which we do of meeting that. But then at the end of every reporting period, at the end of a quarter, at the end of a year, we would have to see if our expectations changed, which they probably will, right? If, for example, we had a year to get the 15,000 hours and maybe 6 months have passed and we're at like 14,500 hours, well, then that bonus becomes much more likely to happen. We can get another 500 hours over the course of 6 months. This expected likelihood would change. And then we just have to adjust the amount of bonus receivable and deferred revenue that we have accrued at that point, right? We'll work through some of that in class. What I want you to get used to right now, just understand the difference, of course, between expected and most likely, understand how to apply them, get your mind wrapped around this whole idea of a bonus receivable being tied to an unlikely, or not an unlikely, but an uncertain outcome, and that represents deferred revenue to Myrmidon if the users meet, if KP Sports users are using this platform extensively. Okay. And so in the case of multiple performance obligations, the variable consideration is typically applied with the transaction price to each of the obligations and determining their relative value. All right, so that's to say, if we were doing something more along the lines of what we saw before with the controller, with the option as well, then what that little note is saying is that really what we'd probably want to adjust instead is this $360 transaction price. But because we didn't have that complication moving around here, all we had was an upfront cost and also this bonus off to the side, then it doesn't really necessarily make sense for us to separate that out in terms of applying a transaction price to all the performance obligations. The next video, we're going to talk about rights of return, and a little bit of receivable accounting. So, blast from the past.